A Qantas Airways Boeing 747 is on final approach to Bangkok's Mueang International Airport in Thailand. The airport is being battered by thunderstorms, and just ahead of the plane, another 747 has aborted its approach at the last minute. The 391 passengers and 19 crew are eager to get down on the ground. On this dark September night, however, as the plane nears the runway, things start to go wrong fast. What follows is not a story about mechanical failure, nor is it even a story about the weather, really. The story of Qantas Flight 1 is a human story. A story about how quickly things can go wrong once a few very human mistakes are made. It's also a story about how even following the rules can sometimes put lives in danger. But to understand what happened on this fateful night, we have to start back at the gate in Sydney, where the fight originated. This is the story of Qantas Flight 1. In the afternoon of September 23, 1999, 391 passengers and 19 crew boarded a Qantas Airways Boeing 747 at Sydney Airport in Australia. Most of the passengers were bound for London, though the plane would first be stopping over at Bangkok to refuel. The journey to Bangkok would take about 8.5 hours. In the cockpit for this flight were 3 pilots: a captain, a first officer, and a second officer, who would step in during the flight to give the other 2 pilots a rest. The captain was 49 years old, and over the course of his long career, he'd accumulated over 15,000 flying hours. He had recently been appointed as a senior check captain, and he held a senior management position in the airline's pilot training department. Because of these duties, he now only flew about 1/3 as often as a regular captain. The first officer, sitting in the right-hand seat, was also highly experienced, with almost 9,000 hours of flying time. He was 36 years old, and due to the fact that he only worked as a pilot and was not involved in the airline's management, he actually had about 7 times more hours on the 747-400 than the captain. He would be flying the aircraft to Bangkok on this afternoon. The second officer, sitting behind the pilots, was 35 years old and had over 6,000 hours of experience, about half of which were on the 747-400. Despite their excellent records, the events which followed would cast doubt on the comprehensiveness of the training each of these pilots received. We'll look into this in more detail in a moment, but first, this episode's sponsor is War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive online vehicle combat game ever made, with more than 2,000 vehicles, including planes, helicopters, tanks, and ships. My favourite thing to do is to get into dogfights with other players over France and the UK in aircraft like this one here. I really like how detailed the vehicles are. They're actually modelled down to their individual components, and the game has a good damage model, so the damage your plane or tank or ship experiences depends on where you get shot. I've also enjoyed how much interaction there is between all the vehicles in the game. As a plane, you're being shot at by other players, playing as ships at sea and tanks on the ground, so it's a really active world. It's free to download and play on PC, Xbox Series X or S, PlayStation 5, and the previous console generation. Click my link in the description to play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox. You get a large free bonus pack by signing up with my link, which includes multiple premium vehicles, a premium account, boosters, and much more. At around 4:30 that afternoon, Qantas Flight 1 pushed back from the gate at Sydney, and the 391 passengers settled in for the 8-hour journey to Bangkok. It was a sunny afternoon in Sydney, but thousands of miles away in Thailand, trouble was brewing. It was monsoon season, and massive thunderstorms were beginning to crop up over the country. The captain had taken on an additional 90 minutes of fuel, fully expecting that he may need to use this as the aircraft neared Bangkok. But for now, all was going smoothly. The first officer steered the gigantic aircraft onto the runway and pushed the engines to take off thrust. A few moments later, the plane became airborne, and the pilot set course for Bangkok. The aircraft being used for this flight was a 9-year-old Boeing 747-400. In 1999, this was a state-of-the-art jet, and the largest passenger airliner in the skies. Qantas had 22 of the aircraft in service, and was using them to replace the lower capacity and less fuel-efficient previous generation of 747s. It had a modern glass cockpit with digital displays instead of analog dials. As well as this, the position of flight engineer had been automated away, so what was once a crew of 3 was now a crew of 2. However, at the time, the airline was still not sure on how to integrate the second officer, who was required on long flights like this. What should be the extent of his role, and how much should he contribute to an operation which, for most 747 flights, took place without him? As a result of the events which followed, Qantas would come under fire for inadequately defining the role of this pilot. The sun set on the aircraft as it made its way northwest over Indonesia, and then out over the South China Sea. While en route at an altitude of 35,000 feet, the meal service went through the cabin, and the pilots reviewed the weather information over Thailand. For the first few hours, the flight proceeded as normal. These moments of calm would be brief, however. The pilots had no idea that waiting for them in Bangkok was a perfect storm, of which the weather was only one component. Just before the crew began their descent, the second officer brought his wife into the cockpit. She sat in the observer's seat behind the captain and would remain there for the rest of the flight. This was not unusual in the days before September 11th, and it was not considered to be a threat to the safe conduct of the flight. About 7.5 hours after takeoff, just before starting the descent into Bangkok, the first officer briefed the other 2 pilots on the approach into the airport. As part of this, he noted that it was raining at the airport, and that there were thunderstorms in the area. This was typical weather for Bangkok at this time of year, and while it would increase the pilot's workload during the approach and landing, it was entirely within their capabilities. However, 3 years previously, in 1996, Qantas had changed some of their procedures for landing the 747 in rainy conditions. These changes had reduced the margin of safety in a way which would become all too clear in the following minutes. We'll explore those changes shortly. At 10:15 that night, Flight 1 began its descent from 35,000 feet. Thai air traffic control told the crew that they could expect to land on runway 21 left at Bangkok. Before starting the descent, the first officer had briefed an approach into the parallel runway, runway 21 right. So, with this switch in mind, he now began briefing the other pilots on the differences between the 2 runways. In particular, he noted that the glide slope, which is the vertical path to the runway, was steeper for runway 21 left than for 21 right, and also that the new runway was narrower. The steeper angle would make it harder for the crew to control their speed during the approach, and the narrower runway would reduce their ability to land in gusty conditions. But still, this was nothing out of the ordinary. The pilots also noted that they would need to roll to the end of the runway after landing, in order to exit via the last taxiway. As such, there wasn't a need for heavy braking, so the captain selected auto brake 2 for landing. The auto brake is a system which automatically applies braking to the wheels on touchdown. It has 5 settings for landing: 1, 2, 3, 4, and max. The captain's selection of auto brake 2 underscored the crew's sense that this landing would be entirely routine, and that the weather was not a serious factor. However, a few minutes later, the controller at Bangkok advised the crew that there was heavy rain at the airport. Water on the runway would increase the aircraft's stopping distance, so the captain then changed the auto brake to setting 3. On a dry runway, the wheel brakes are by far the most powerful way of stopping the aircraft. However, on wet runways, aerodynamic drag generated by the spoilers and reverse thrust from the engines become the primary means of stopping the aircraft, at least at higher speeds. The brakes become less effective on wet runways as hydroplaning becomes an issue. At this point, though not concerning, the weather was the main thing on the crew's mind. Air traffic control had advised them that the visibility at the airport was 4 kilometers, which was well within Qantas's limits for first officers of 1.5 kilometers. However, there were heavy rain showers in the area, which would dramatically reduce the visibility if the crew flew through them. They were still 70 kilometers from Bangkok at this point, but the captain could see a thunderstorm directly over the airport on his weather radar, and others nearby. He noted that these thunderstorms were well defined, meaning that there were patches of sky which were basically clear with good visibility, and patches of sky characterized by torrential downpours. It was really a question of timing whether the crew found themselves on approach as a thunderstorm passed over the airport. As they neared the airport, the pilots completed the approach checklist. They planned to land with flaps extended to 25 degrees, and with a final approach speed of 154 knots. This flap setting of 25 had been deemed appropriate by Qantas Airlines for 747s arriving into airports in weather conditions like this. It had been changed from a recommended flap setting of 30 degrees a few years previously to reduce noise and fuel burn. However, it meant that the approach had to be conducted slightly faster. The guidance on reverse thrust had also been updated. Previously, full reverse thrust was advised on wet runways, but in 1996 this had been changed to idle reverse thrust. These changes would now come back to haunt the airline a mere 3 years after they were made, but they were by no means the entire story behind what was about to happen. The crew continued their descent as air traffic control cleared them to a point about 10 nautical miles from runway 21 left. There were 2 aircraft ahead of Qantas 1, about 3 minutes ahead of them was Qantas Flight 15, another 747, and a further 3 minutes ahead of that plane was the Thai Airways Airbus A330. The Qantas pilots overheard the controller advise the Thai Airways jet that there was heavy rain over the airport and that the visibility was 5 kilometers. They could see thunderstorms over the airport out the windscreen at this point, and on their weather radar. They were used to weather like this in the tropics, however, and while such weather increased the chances of turbulence, wind shear, and reduced visibility, it was nothing new to the pilots. However, over the next few minutes, an unfortunate series of mistakes would snowball into a serious threat to the safety of all 410 people on board. This all started on approach, when the first officer found it hard to slow the aircraft down to its target speed. The captain repeatedly urged him to reduce his speed, and the first officer acknowledged this, but he had trouble doing it. At one point, he extended the speed brake on the wings to help bring the speed back, yet still, the aircraft remained fast. Nonetheless, it was still within company limits for a safe approach. As the pilots continued their descent, the second officer was listening into a conversation on his radio set between a Qantas ground engineer at Bangkok and the company agent on the airline's frequency. The ground engineer had stated that it was, quote, raining quite heavily at the time. However, the second officer did not pass this information on to the pilots, as their workload was increasing and he didn't want to distract them from their main task of flying the aircraft. Still on autopilot, the plane intercepted the glide slope and began descending towards the runway. Unbeknownst to the crew, a few miles ahead, the other Qantas 747 had commenced a go-round just 250 feet above the runway. The rain had been so heavy that they had lost sight of the runway lights even that close to the runway. Unfortunately, the pilots of Flight 1 did not hear that this aircraft had gone around, because they had not yet been transferred from approach control over to the tower frequency. The crew continued their approach and lowered the landing gear. They were slightly fast, but otherwise in good shape for landing. Shortly thereafter, the first officer disengaged the autopilot and autothrottle and began flying the plane manually. Long-haul pilots spend most of their time in cruise flight on autopilot, so it's good practice for them to keep up their hand-flying skills when conditions permit. The tower then cleared Flight 1 to land, and advised the pilots that the Thai aircraft landing ahead of them had reported that braking action was good. This was good news for the pilots, as it meant that they should have little problem stopping the aircraft. The crew confirmed between themselves that the aircraft was in its final landing configuration, with the gear down, the spoilers armed, and the flaps set to 25. They planned to use idle reverse thrust on landing, meaning that they would put the engines into reverse thrust to help the plane slow down, but that they would not use any power to slow the plane down further. This combination of flaps 25 and idle reverse thrust was in line with Qantas company procedures for landing in these conditions, but we'll soon see why this was questionable. As the aircraft continued down towards the runway, the first officer commented that the plane felt like it didn't want to slow down. He was trying to get it to fly at the target approach speed of 154 knots, but was having difficulty getting it down to this speed. The captain was unperturbed by this though, in part because the speed was decreasing, however slowly, so the first officer continued the approach. Moments later, the plane entered a rain shower, and it became harder to see the runway. The first officer asked for the windshield wipers to be turned on. As they neared the runway, the rain picked up dramatically. In fact, in his thousands of hours of flying, the first officer had never experienced rain this heavy on approach. He was now well above the target approach speed and was beginning to get high on the glide slope. The sound of the rain hitting the cockpit windows was tremendous. In a few moments, things would start to go wrong very quickly. Split-second decisions by the pilots would endanger the safety of all 391 passengers on board.
You're getting high now. You happy? Yes.
The first officer continued the approach, despite being at the limit of what he was comfortable with. As the aircraft neared the runway, it started to float, and wouldn't settle down on the tarmac.
Get it down. Come on, you're starting your flare.
The rain made it hard for the first officer to judge his height above the runway. Realising that the aircraft was fast, and that it had already passed over much of the runway, the captain moved the auto brake switch up a notch to 4. Then, he lost sight of the end of the runway in the rain. It was no longer clear how much runway was left.
Go round.
The first officer pushed the thrust levers to take off power, and began bringing the aircraft up for a go-round. But the sheer inertia of the massive aircraft meant that for a few moments it continued descending. It then touched down the runway, and when it did, the captain yanked the thrust levers back to their idle stop, cancelling the go-round. However, he didn't tell the other crew members that this was his intention. And critically, when he grabbed the engine throttle levers, he had missed the lever for engine number 1, meaning that it was still at takeoff power. This meant that even though the aircraft's main wheels had now touched down, the wing spoilers didn't deploy. As a safety feature, they need all engines to be on idle in order to deploy. The first officer was unsure as to who was flying the aircraft, and he didn't know whether the intention was still to go around. In any case, the aircraft was now on the runway, and he began to commit to the landing.
Okay, we're on. Got it? Yeah, I got it.
The first officer continued with the landing roll, and seeing that the engine 1 thrust lever was in the forward position, he pulled it back to idle. Now that all engines were in the idle position, the spoilers deployed automatically, but precious seconds had been wasted. The plane had touched down much faster than it was supposed to, and much further down the runway than normal. The runway was wet, the visibility was poor, and to make matters worse, the auto brake had been disarmed. Just like the spoilers, it requires all engines to be on idle thrust in order to engage, and since engine 1 had been at takeoff power, it had simply disarmed for good. Crucially, none of the crew noticed this, so for a few critical seconds, the wheel brakes were not engaged at all. The only thing slowing the plane down were the spoilers. Even on a dry runway, this would be a serious problem. In fact, it was only when the first officer realised that the plane still wasn't accelerating that he slammed on the brakes. However, even still, the plane continued to speed down the runway. The wheels were now aquaplaning, and the brakes were just 1/3 as effective as they would have been on a dry runway. The pilots were looking forwards out the windscreen, desperately willing their massive aircraft to slow down, and watching the end of the runway get closer and closer. In the stress of the moment, they never noticed that not even idle reverse thrust had been selected on the engines. Had it occurred to them to use reverse thrust, they would likely have put the engines into full reverse thrust at this stage, as they were quickly running out of runway. But they simply forgot to do this. The only things the pilots were using to stop were the wheel brakes, which were markedly less effective on the wet runway, and the wing spoilers. The crew watched helplessly as their aircraft sped towards the end of the runway, apparently incapable of slowing down. Still travelling at around 90 knots, the plane went off the end of the runway and collided with the ILS antenna. Its nose gear and right wing landing gear collapsed, and the right-hand engines began digging into the muddy soil. The aircraft shook violently, and in the cabin, ceiling panels began collapsing on top of passengers. Overhead bins opened, and their contents began spilling out into the cabin. The plane continued sliding for another 100 metres through the wet, boggy soil before finally coming to a stop, with the nose resting on the airport perimeter road. After a tense waiting period to assess the damage, the captain gave the order to disembark the aircraft. Luckily, all 410 passengers and crew managed to escape relatively unscathed, with 38 people suffering minor injuries. But how had this aircraft come so close to disaster in the first place? Qantas had one of the best safety records of any airline in the world. In fact, since the beginning of the jet age, it had never written off a single plane due to a crash. their aircraft were well maintained and their crews well trained. What could cause an accident as basic as a runway overrun? As it turned out, the investigation into this accident uncovered some critical weaknesses in certain aspects of the airline's operation. Investigators from the Australian Transportation Safety Board determined that the pilots didn't properly consider the effect that water on the runway would have on the brake's ability to stop the aircraft. As a result, they didn't choose a landing configuration which would have helped the aircraft slow down more effectively, like flaps 30 and full reverse thrust. Interestingly, however, the investigation found that this inadequate preparation was not merely a case of pilot error. In fact, this combination of flaps 25 and idle reverse thrust was in fact standard company procedure at Qantas. Relatedly, the final report also cited as a contributing factor that the first officer did not fly the aircraft accurately during the final approach. In part, this was due to his selection of flaps 25, which made it harder to control his speed. However, he also allowed the aircraft to get high on short final, which, coupled with its high speed, meant that he touched down far further down the runway than he should have. This gave the aircraft less distance to stop, which contributed to the overrun. The report also noted failures in crew resource management, or in other words, teamwork between the pilots. In particular, the captain's failure to announce that he was cancelling the go-around when he pulled back the thrust levers led to confusion among the other pilots as to whether the go-around was continuing. This led to precious seconds being lost, which were needed for stopping the aircraft. Furthermore, after touchdown, all three pilots failed to notice that the engines had not been brought into reverse thrust. The captain's decision to take control of the throttles when he pulled them back to idle may have contributed to this, as up until that point, the first officer had been flying the plane. The story of Qantas Flight 1 is a lesson in how quickly things can go wrong on landing if a few critical conditions are not met. It's also a lesson on the importance of good crew resource management, and in its ability to prevent a relatively benign situation from becoming potentially deadly. If you want to see a recent example of the quality of crew resource management at Qantas these days, take a look at my video on Qantas Flight 32 on the top right of the screen here. It's fortunate that the lessons learned from Flight 1 were learned without any loss of life, and it's a credit to Qantas that these were fully incorporated into their training and procedures after the incident. As an interesting aside, Qantas initially determined that the damage to the plane meant that it should be written off. However, the airline was eager to maintain its perfect record in the jet age of not having had a single hull loss of any passenger aircraft. So, at great expense, they repaired the aircraft, and it returned to service with the airline and flew until 2013. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Click my link in the description box to play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation or Xbox. There's a big free bonus for using this link, which includes multiple premium vehicles, a premium account, boosters, and much more. I should also mention that you don't need any special hardware to play. A mouse and a keyboard is all you need. I'd like to thank the Patreon and YouTube members for helping to make this video possible. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel for as little as €3 per month. I've put the links for that on the screen here. I'd especially like to thank Joey and Steve Wilcox for their very generous support. Green Dot Aviation now has a Discord server, so if you'd like to join a growing community of people discussing all things aviation, just tap on the link in the video description and I'll see you there. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon for the next episode.